Professor,
Yes,
hi. Can I please ask a quick question?
yes.
So, during the New Stone Age, you mentioned that there was more tools made, and I was just wondering if they were the same tools or the variety started to emerge, like there was different kinds of tools that
I
people.
think there was a greater variety of tools as well. Both we find more tools and we find um, quite a degree of inventiveness. All kinds of tools that are being discovered in that period. So that's my answer. Anything else you want to?
No, thank you. That's
Is
it.
that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good afternoon. Resuming our narrative, today, one of the things we're going to do, especially at the beginning of the lecture, is go over the first two review questions. As I've explained, these review questions are the basis of the exams, and I'm carefully going to review them so that I'm prepping you for the exam. But before I start doing that, I want to get a little bit into the lecture because it's sensible in terms of doing the review. So overall, the lecture is going to deal with, we're briefly going to review the Neolithic period, and then at that point, we're going to deal with the first question, which deals with the importance of tools and the development of civilization. And then we'll move on to the invention of agriculture, and that will be the second review question. And from there, we'll proceed to look at the presumably still considered the oldest civilization on Earth, the civilization of Sumer in southern Iraq. And eventually, so we're going to look at Mesopotamian civilization and eventually arrive at Egyptian civilization. That's the overall program. So let's begin with the Neolithic period, which we were discussing in last class. And we saw that this begins around 10,000 BC, and that it's marked especially by, we know about it especially because we see, as I was speaking a little bit earlier, that the character of the tool making changes, discovered by archaeologists around 10,000. Whereas in the Old Stone Age, the tools, there are fewer of them and they're crude. We have crude hammers, stone hammers, and we do have arrows, with bows and arrows existed, but the arrows are quite crude. And in the Neolithic period, the tools become, there are many more of them, and they, like for example, they studied arrowheads. They're much more carefully shaped. They have sharp edges. Much more sophisticated craftsmanship goes into the making of the tools in the Neolithic period as compared to the Paleolithic. But the Neolithic is also marked by the invention of agriculture. And discussing this, there are signs of agriculture already have been found in places like Laos and Cambodia around 9,500 BC. And in the Near East, shortly thereafter, around 9,000 BC, we see that clear signs that agriculture has emerged. And the agriculture that does develop in the Middle East is particularly marked in the so-called Fertile Crescent, which runs from all the way through Iraq and Syria into Lebanon, Israel, down into Egypt, Jordan and Egypt. And this whole area was a prairie. It was a great grasslands. The Ice Age was receding, and this area was still had very considerable rainfall, and uh, that proved to be very good for agriculture. So we see that between, say, 9500 BC and 3000, the whole area is marked by a very substantial agriculture. Gradually, the area becomes drier and drier. And so over this stretch of 7,000 years, the agriculture tends to concentrate, especially in the river valleys, the river valley of the Nile in Egypt, and the river valley of present-day Iraq, in ancient times called Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates River. This is Iraq, this country where the earliest civilization was born. And let me remind you, this is the area the Americans were bringing civilization to Iraq. You imagine, it's incredible. In any case, it's generally thought that women who were the gatherers in hunting and gathering society essentially invented agriculture. The wild grasses were domesticated and became the grains for this agriculture. We noticed that about 8000 BC, the first signs of agriculture spread into into the Balkans, into Southern Europe. At the same time, roughly the same dates, between 9 and 8000 BC, we see that sheep herding also begins. In other words, what we call pastoralism, which is a kind of variant of the raising of grain. Sheep herding, or the grazing of sheep, but also goats and so on, is invented between 9 and 8000 BC. And that with agriculture, of course, the surpluses, the food surpluses, which become available to people, are much greater. They also abandon the wandering of the hunting and gathering period, because in the hunting and gathering period, people are, this is a generalization, wander through the hunting grounds, which are very extensive. But now we see all over the Middle East, agricultural villages based on agriculture developed during the Neolithic period, between 10,000 and 3,000 people. There's a much larger population is possible as a result of this. At the same time, a certain number of people can actually take up other occupations. They can begin to specialize in, they can become craftsmen, making all kinds of other objects. So there's a greater division of labor develops in these villages. Some people spending their time as craftsmen. And overall, I would say that this is a period characterized by a high degree of democracy. And as I was saying, in other words, the peasants, the population of these villages, there's no landlords, there's no rent to pay. They keep what they produce. There's a lot of abundance, and the social organization is highly democratic. A lot of people have written about the Neolithic period as a period of real human happiness. On the other hand, we do see that in these villages, there begin to be certain individuals, powerful individuals, who scholars refer to as village big men, because inevitably there are disputes over land, over all kinds of social questions. families quarrel with one another, and some people have to settle these disputes. And these village big men um, begin to play a role. And the reason I single them out is that scholars suggest that the development of a ruling class in society, basically there were two sources of this. In other words, how did classes emerge? Well, it's thought that over time, especially as land became scarcer with the drying up of the Middle East, land became scarcer, the land disputes, water became more precious. So the role of these big men became stronger and stronger. Um, and the other factor might be invasion from outside, invaders living on the periphery of these areas, coming in and basically setting themselves up as conquerors over the peasants who lived in these communities. And out of this, there seems to have emerged in Mesopotamia, for example, between about 4,000 and 3,000, a landlord class and the first rulers appear in these areas. But overall, I would say that things were highly democratic during this Neolithic period. Another thing that has to be mentioned is that the smelting of copper, which is a prelude to the invention of tin. Tin comes in around 3,500 BC. Tin is copper and tin. Sorry, bronze is copper and tin. Bronze is sturdier than copper. It comes in, as I say, between 7 and 6,000 BC. Another significant thing about the copper that begins to be used is that the ore is not immediately located around these villages. No, the ore is to be found in the mountains at some distance away from the river valleys of Mesopotamia. And so we see the first merchants and the first trade routes beginning to develop during the Neolithic period. In fact, scholars claim that merchants were active all over the Middle East and indeed traveling across Asia, even during the Neolithic period. And so that's quite in other words, merchants and trade begin to develop in this period. Now, the last innovation that I want to mention, the last innovations occur between about 4,000 and 3,000 BC, is the invention of pottery, the potter's wheel, and also spinning and weaving, the making of clothing out of wool. It develops as well between about 4 and 3,000 BC. So you can see, looking over, that this is a highly productive, creative period based on a lot of democracy, frankly. Now, having said all this, I want to now deal with the two review questions before we move on to look at the Sumer. Now, the first question is, what role did tools play in the development of human culture in the prehistoric age? That's review question number 1 in your syllabus. So the question is, how are you going to answer this? And you know, these are going to be take-home questions. So you want to give, I'm not saying that you have to get every detail that I'm giving you right, but I'm sort of suggesting what would go into an answer. First of all, you want to tell me, well, the prehistoric age, well, that's the period from the very first signs of humanity, round about 4 million years ago, down to roughly 3000 BC. This is the before civilization appeared. So that's the prehistoric period. That's what the question refers to. And then you can tell me, well, there was the Paleolithic period from around 200,000 to 10,000, and there was the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, between 10,000 and 3,000. And you would briefly say, well, the tools in the Paleolithic were crude. The tools in the Neolithic period were much more skillfully made, sharp edges, and so on. Now, tool making is important to the development of civilization because first of all, the use of the manufacture of these tools and the use of them involves a high degree of cooperation and division of labor, as well as development of language, is linked to the making of these tools. And that this cooperation, division of labor, development of language is associated with the enlargement of the human brain. So man as man, or human beings as human beings, Homo sapien, knowing man, a prerequisite is a certain level of intelligence. And so the human brain develops in relationship to tool making and the cooperation that is entailed by the use of these tools. So that's basically the larger part of the answer. And then you say, well, of course, in this initial period, that is, say, the Old Stone Age, essentially the cultures that did exist were hunting and gathering cultures, where there was a high degree of equality. There was sharing, and everybody was engaged in either hunting and gathering. So basically, there was only the simplest form of the gender division of labor, and that would be an answer. Does anybody have any questions about this answer? Somebody, Pietro, asked about the date of the Paleolithic, 200,000 BC, right. Anybody have any questions about this particular answer? Yes, that would add something. Mentioning angles, I would say that angles has become more and more important. I mean, during the Cold War, forget about it. In universities, nobody mentioned angles. Afraid to mention angles. But now, you go back to Engels' writing, it's incredible how prescient the guy was. You know, Engels' idea of primitive communism and so on, and his understanding of this period was remarkable. Anything else that people want to mention?
Hi.
Yes.
Would discussing how, the more sophisticated and accurate the weapon is, the more likely you are to the more successful you're likely to be when you're trying to kill something, be
That's right.
along the right lines of the answer as well?
Absolutely.
All right.
That's right.
Thank you.
By the way, I don't know if any of you have ever looked at 2001 and the movie, the Kubrick movie. It's on YouTube. The beginning of that movie, it's Kubrick's idea of the invention of tools, and it's a brilliant scene. It's certainly worth looking at. YouTube 2001, Space Odyssey. Some people seem to have watched it. At just the beginning, they show this clip because it's so classic and so dramatic. Take a look at it. So the next question is, why was the invention of agriculture the decisive step in the development of civilization? Well, bottom line, just to begin with, it all has to do with the surpluses that are produced. Way more food is immediately available, which makes possible people, the social differentiation, the emergence of craftsmen, and ultimately an upper class, a class of landlords and state bureaucrats who don't have to engage in production at all. They can live off the labor of the rest of the population. They administer or they fight. And so the invention of this, and these are all essential attributes of a state. And so they're preconditions for the existence of civilization. That is the short answer. Of course, I want a more extended answer. I want you to tell me something about the invention of agriculture, like what we just reviewed. Agriculture comes in around maybe a little bit in Asia, but it's mainly in Mesopotamia that we have the evidence for, the earliest evidence for it. The Fertile Crescent, the role of women. You should mention those things. Maybe the development of pastoralism, that the Neolithic period was a period of great prosperity and democracy and so on. That would be essentially elaborated, would be the answer to the second question. Does anybody want further elaboration? Okay, good. So having gone over the review questions, and I noticed that the third question has to do with the development of writing, probably will come up today in today's lecture. And if it does, we will review it in the next class to make sure that you have a grasp of it. So in terms of civilization, we can say that, to repeat, what are the characteristics of a civilization? Well, civilization is characterized by massive, agriculture, substantial food surpluses, the development of classes, and I explained where village big men become basically the rulers, the landlord class, if you like, and the rulers of the state. So we have the classes, we have agriculture, we have classes, we have the state, we have organized religion, we have monumental building, and we have inequality between men and women develops under conditions of civilization. The men own the property, the women are excluded. So that's the definition of civilization. And as I said, the drawing out of the Middle East, the fact that the water available through irrigation was available in the river valleys. So therefore you get along the Nile River to the west and east of the Nile River, and in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. It's here that the first civilizations appear. And so far as the state is concerned, the state basically consists of a ruler who also has religious functions. In Mesopotamia, the first rulers were essentially priests. The military and the bureaucracy constituted the state. There was a landlord class, a consolidated landlord class. If you were a peasant and you wanted to farm a piece of land, you no longer had possession of it. It was the possession of somebody else. And you paid a rent and you paid taxes to the state in order to have access to the land. We're talking about the class system, which of course, historically has been part of civilization down to our own time. And of course, in terms of these first civilizations in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, control over water, land reclamation, channeling the water, the use of the water was an extremely important activity for the state. The state played a huge role in this water control. And so this is, in addition to defense, the function of the state has a lot to do with hydraulic control, we call it that. Now, I want to the first civilization that we know about is found here. You see this square box on the screen. This is Iraq. These are the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And in southern Iraq, where the Shiites live today, this is the state of Sumer, was the first civilized society. It was, the archaeologists excavated this area in the first half of the 20th century. And we know a lot about Sumer as a result. There were many towns actually that existed. You see, between the two rivers in this region here, there were many towns. And these towns, the population of these towns no longer lived by agriculture. The peasants were out in the field. In the towns, there lived the administrators of the state, including the soldiers and the bureaucrats, the priests who controlled the temples, and also craftsmen and merchants were to be found in the towns. Town life develops during this period. There is perhaps as many as 10% of the population could live in the towns off the food being produced by the peasants. Now, politically, this area was divided. There was no unified state. Each city was its own state. In other words, there were city-states, small little states that controlled the town and the surrounding area. And the king was also the priest. The high priest of the temple was also the king. There were obviously other priests in attendance on the king, and the temples. I don't know whether I have that available. Yes, these uh, temples are known as ziggurat temples, which were basically the political capital, but also the temple was the religious center of the community. And they're called ziggurats because it's sort of like a zigzag kind of a shape. The temples have an architecture, which is a kind of a sort of zigzag architecture. So they're called ziggurats. And as I say, the priests combined political and religious functions. They were the ones who decided who was admitted to the land. They dispute land disputes, because land is limited now, are decided by the priests. Water control, and of course, they also they have these magical religious powers. So the ordinary people who don't have the magical powers of the priests, and the priests are the first people who know how to read and write. This is also very important. I'll get to that in a minute. They have enormous power over the population. Plus, they're backed up by the soldiers who are employed by them. So these priests are quite important. And as I said, below them are the soldiers, the bureaucrats, who basically execute their orders. In the towns, the merchants, the artisans, slavery, people who are taken in warfare are usually, if they're not killed, are enslaved. So there is an underclass of slaves already in these early, what we call Bronze Age societies, because the basic material that's being used to make tools is bronze now. Bronze weapons, and also all kinds of implements that are being manufactured out of bronze. Now, as part of these developments is the invention of writing, and I want to spend a little time on this. It's important. Well, the earliest form of writing was simply pictures. Why did writing develop? Writing developed essentially in order to keep records. If you want to tax people, collect their rent, you have to know, how much land they have, whether they have paid their rent last year, how much rent was collected. All of these kinds of information are extremely important, not only to the landlords, the immediate overlords of the peasants, but also to the state in order to collect taxes from the population. So the first writing we know about is the Mesopotamians. They wrote on clay tablets. We know that they used wet clay in order to write, and they would have a stick, which was called a cuneus, and they would write on the tablet. Well, the earliest form was a picture. So many bushels of wheat and so on. But then over time, and this already happened under the Sumerians, these clay tablets have been preserved, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. We have these pictures. Some pictures remain, but basically the writing becomes syllabic. That is to say, it's a writing in syllable, like our language is alphabetic. Basically, what do we have? 26 letters, and with the 26 letters, we can write 100,000 words with this 26-letter alphabet. Well, the syllabic writing broke these spoken words into syllables. And so this, the second form of writing that was developed was syllabic writing. Alphabetic writing was only invented around 1000 BC. So right through the Bronze Age, you have this syllabic language. Now, can anybody tell me of a language which is still back in the Bronze Age? It's a contemporary language. It's an important language, which is still basically a syllabic language. Does anybody know of such a language?
Latin?
Chinese. Chinese.
Wouldn't linear A or linear B
What's
with,
that?
like the Greeks? Linear A or linear B with the Greeks, weren't those syllabic, or is that a little bit more in the future here?
It's a little bit more later. Yes, yes, you know a little bit about it. Yeah. Well, I think linear A, I think, is a syllabic language as far as I know, because I think it's these merchants in what is now Lebanon and northern Israel, the earliest alphabetical languages, 1100, 1200, 1000. The languages in the Bronze Age were syllabic. But Chinese, it's amazing. It takes the Chinese Chinese kids a very long time to learn how to read their language, because it's a syllabic language. Most peasants couldn't be bothered. It was beyond them. This kind of syllabic language. So what I'm saying is that the priests, who were the only ones who could read this language, were enormously powerful. This not only did they have these magical religious powers and political power, but they could read and write this syllabic language. So this gave them an enormous literacy. Was a preserve of very few people in the society at the very top of society. These societies, these Bronze Age societies, were very hierarchical. People were really subordinated within these societies. From the democracy of the Iron Age, you descend to this, this very hierarchical, and I would say overall oppressive. Certainly, there's a certain security living in this kind of society, but at the same time, these societies are quite oppressive. The state and the class system weighs heavily on the population. Now, in this period that I'm speaking about, as I say, most of the tablets that have been found really deal with practical matters: rent, taxes, how much grain was grown, and so on. But we do know that what we do have was recovered what is considered to be the first literary work in history, the first work of literature, called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written down toward the end of the third millennium, say around 2100 BC, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a long epic poem, relatively long epic poem. And there's some things in there that are intriguing, like there's mention of a kind of Adam and Eve story. I mean, the Adam and Eve story appears in the Old Testament. Well, it's not the same, but there is a story of the fall based on a kind of story that evokes Adam and Eve. There is a story of a great flood, which of course we also find in the New Testament, and also the story of the Tower of Babel. These are all Old Testament stories. What I'm saying is that we see them in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they were presumably part of the folklore of the Middle East, and ultimately found their way in the early books of the Old Testament. Now, to speak a little bit more about the religion, would say furthermore that originally every significant town had its own, obviously, chief priest, temple, and its own god. There was a city god, a god that governed the fortunes of the city. But over time, as political amalgamation occurred in Samaria, as one city grew powerful and conquered the others and so on, over time, by say around the year 2250, what we can call a kind of pantheon of gods. There were the larger gods, the more powerful gods, then there were the lesser gods. There was a kind of theology that developed. Some gods were more powerful than associated with powerful cities, were more powerful than the other gods. This, of course, is a pantheistic culture, but nevertheless, a certain hierarchy of gods existed. Now, again, to just reiterate, the priests were extremely powerful people. And why so? Because, well, they were the political rulers, but also they governed the relationship between the mass of the population and the natural world. If you're going to get waters that were plentiful in the rivers with which to fertilize the fields, you had to placate the gods that controlled nature. So these priests, who could also, of course, write, they were thought by their rituals in the temple to placate the gods. And at the same time, they taught the people the necessity of social obedience. Obey the priests, respect the landlords, respect those in authority over you. Those are fundamental teachings which help to control the mass of the population. And as I have already mentioned, but it deserves to be underlined, certainly we have now, this is a society based on economic classes. There is a landlord class that is the closest to the state. It's the sons of the landlord class that basically become the commanders in the military. They become the priests. It's a small elite, which basically controls the whole society. There is, of course, the army and the bureaucracy. Women who shared in the, both had a considerable degree of power in the hunting and gathering societies, and even in Neolithic society, which were, of course, agricultural, but still women had a certain role. They, the legal systems that we know about exclude them from property rights. And this, of course, is this continues right down to the 19th century. Now, one further thing that should be said is that compared to the hunting and gathering society, to build these temples, to build these ziggurats, required a certain level of technical and even scientific competence. So we could say the level of science and technology was higher than in previous modes of production. And indeed, we know that certain mathematics developed. Mathematics developed already in the Sumerian civilization, and that, for example, we know that, in our number system, we have what we call positional notation. There is 1, there's 10, there is 100. Well, their number system, it's not exactly the same, but they had the position of the number basically gave you the sense of the quantity, whether it was 1 or 10, the same figure placed in a different position expressed a larger or smaller number. And they even had the beginnings of a decimal system. Another thing that we see in Sumer is that they used wheeled vehicles. You know that pottery is made on the potter's wheel, even today. Pottery is formed by spinning on a potter's wheel. Well, presumably there was the wheels, and somebody got the idea that instead of carrying carts by hand, that you could put wheels on these carts. And so the Sumerians used wheeled carts, which of course, in terms of moving things, is a lot easier. So that this is an important breakthrough for them. Now, having spoken about this earlier civilization, you have to ask, well, what's the good? The people have lost a lot of their freedom in this kind of society. It's true that they have perhaps more assured food supplies and so on, but the loss of freedom is obvious and so on. So you exchange security for freedom and so on. It's sad. But I want to mention that, well, Sumer in the first phase, we can date the Sumerian period, the first period of Sumer. It was, as I say, it never achieved the political unification, but it lasted, let's say, if we give it its beginning around 3200 BC, it lasted until 2400 BC. So about 800 years is the Sumerian period, first Sumerian period, 3200 to 2400 BC. And it was succeeded by a whole succession. I'm not going to go into it, and here you see I meant the Sumerian period, but then it's succeeded by a whole number of other periods that I'm, you see Hittites, Kassites, the Babylonians. I'll allude to this a little bit, but very little. The question is to come back to it, well, what's the good of this and so on? Well, it's interesting because, as a matter of fact, Marx took a very positive view of this. If, in fact, we have primitive communism, but he wanted full communism, and he said that what has to happen is that in order to have true communism, you need absolute abundance. Scarcity has to disappear. The fundamental problem is human scarcity. We have to develop civilization. We have to develop the productive power. Civilization produces productive powers, which make possible huge surpluses, not only of food, but of everything else. We have Costco and all the rest of it. Absolute abundance is possible. Well, what Marx argued was that the class conflict, the class differences created constant state of tension in these civilized societies, starting with Sumeria and continuing from that point onward. Constant, say, conflict between landlords and peasants, but also the landlords, they spent a lot of time, especially war was there outside of collecting rents, preparing for war, going to war against your neighbor, becoming a distinguished officer, general in the army. This is what they did. And Marx's view was this class conflict and war led to change. He considered war and class conflict as the motors of history. Why did history progress? Why do we move from the Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece and Rome and so on and so on, onward and onward. Well, he said that it's the class conflict and constant wars which are the motors of history. So leading to ultimately unlimited production and the possibility of a fully equal society. He was a real romantic, this guy. The 19th century will continue in the next class.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a great day.
You too, Henry.
See ya. Look forward to it.
Guy, I don't unmute you.